What I will do today is, I maybe should have done already at the Belgrade conference or even earlier. What I want to introduce you to is ERC starting ground project on the history of non-territorial autonomy that we are having actually already. We are working already have been working for 3 years at the University of Vienna. But I never introduced it thoroughly to this Entan crowd, and so I thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to do it today. So I rather present you what we are doing and what we are hoping to show or hoping to prove, and it's not clear-cut results. But I think we are in a good way. So what is the overarching objective? The overarching objective of this project is to provide a new understanding of how the management of ethno-national diversity was conceived and implemented in the area of nationalism. So we have a broad scope, and we realized that since the mid of the 19th century, we have seen individual approaches to minority protection, collective rights, territorial approaches, and a collective rights approach. And our project scrutinizes this third kind of approach, so collective rights approach. So when minority rights are granted to collective bodies as legal entities that unite persons of a common ethno-national affiliation wherever they might live within a country. So, non-territorial autonomy, I don't really have to explain this to you, is based on a person's belonging to a collectivity and not on a person's place of residence. So what we do, we explore non-territorial autonomy as a political idea and as an applied policy across Europe over the last 150 years. We want to understand how this idea circulated synchronically, so in the time across Europe, and how it meandered diachronically through the 20th century. And the first objective is to trace the origins of this idea, which are, on the one hand, to be found in the Habsburg monarchy in the wake of the revolution of 1848. This was a time when different actors started a decades-long reflection on how to reorganize the empire in order to grant equal rights to all nationalities. Many agreed that this cannot be achieved according to the territorial principle, but only according to the personal principle. So the proponents and also the critics of non-territorial autonomy was a wide range of very different people: liberal scholars, legal scholars, political activists, policymakers, and they exchanged their opinion in this Habsburg laboratory of nationalities policies. Most important for the conceptualization of non-territorial autonomy, and certainly not unfamiliar to this audience, we already heard with Pete and with Ronnie the importance of the Austro-Marxist thinkers, most notably Edwin Christian, who's very often forgotten, and Karl Renner, and actually less Otto Bauer for the non-territorial autonomy idea. So what was the main idea of these social democrats? They were convinced that states and nations were inherently different things. So states were territorial political entities, and whereas nations were non-territorial mental cultural communities. Thus, Renner proposed to separate the state from the nation by delimiting their respective competences. So he did not want to isolate the nationalities from each other or from the state. On the opposite, he wanted to build the state with the nations, but with clearly allotted tasks. Therefore, Renner's autonomy model gave every citizen basically two souls, a political and a national soul, And each soul would vote and would elect its own organs, which in the end would result in kind of a dual state organization. A general supranational central parliament responsible for general political matters, and in parallel, each national group should constitute itself as a legal entity with autonomous organs. So this concept was never realized in the Habsburg monarchy, but it was discussed in both parts, in the Hungarian and in the Austrian part, and several Austrian provinces passed new provincial constitutions that comprised elements of non-territorial autonomy. Ronnie talked, no, it was Pete who talked about the Ausgleiche, or was it Ronnie? I can't remember. But our emphasis when searching for the origins is not only the Habsburg Empire, but we are also interested in the interconnections and entanglements between the Habsburg and the Russian Empire that allowed the idea of an NTA to develop. These interconnections were not symmetrical. There was a more vivid discussion on it in Imperial Austria than in Tsarist Russia, and Russian protagonists followed Austrian development more closely than vice versa. But still there was a communication. However, it would also be wrong to think of a linear transfer of ready-made non-territorial autonomy concepts from Austria to Russia. Russian intellectuals had debated state reform, decentralization, and national diversity management for decades. And this is why NTA ideas fell on fertile ground in the first decade of the 20th century, exactly because non-territorial autonomy could be translated into these pre-existing discourses. So the origins of non-territorial autonomy are thus equally be found in Russia. The second objective is that we look into the interwar period when non-territorial autonomy was widely discussed in many Central and Eastern European nation states, and these nation states were in fact multinational states. We used the metaphor of traveling because this concept was not transferred from A to B, but sometimes it took long serpentines to arrive. The second objective is to understand why and how this idea translated into different countries and across the ideological spectrum. So what we claim is that non-territorial autonomy per se is lacking a political color. It is rather a container that could be filled from the far left to the far right. And according to this ideological spectrum, we designed 4 work packages. We first investigate how and to what extent the early Soviet Union used non-territorial autonomy arrangements in their active policy. Normally, the Soviet Union is considered to be a very territorialized federalization, but what we want to show, or we argue that at least the early Soviet Union experimented also with non-territorial autonomy arrangements. For instance, we see such kinds of arrangements in the structure of the Commissariat for Nationalities Affairs and within the national sections of the Bolshevik Party. The second work package would look at the social democrat adaptation in the Ukrainian People's Republic. This was a very short-lived country, a left-leaning country, but it was the first country in the world that legally introduced non-territorial autonomy legislation in 1918. And those who were in charge of introducing non-territorial autonomy for the country's Russian, Polish, and Jewish minority, they were very well aware where this idea came from. Then, in another work package looks at the implementation of this idea in Baltic states by liberal politicians. The Baltic states is the most often cited example for non-territorial autonomy, in particular Estonia, that certainly had the most minority-friendly legislation in Europe. It was modeled after the needs of the German minority, but it was also implemented by the Jewish minority. And our aim is to analyze how this idea developed, which connections there are to be found with Austro-Marxist ideas, but all this Timo will talk about in 10 minutes because he's working on this and he knows much better than I do. And then we have a last package in this second objective. That's the instrumentalization of this idea by the radical right. And here we are looking at the far-right Sudeten German party in interwar Czechoslovakia. And here we analyze how the idea could be translated into a radical right ethno-federalist model that the Sudeten German party developed in the mid-1930s. Before in 1938 they opted for annexation to the German Reich, but before they had a model that had non-territorial arrangements. And we want to explore how these politicians transformed the concept of non-territorial autonomy into a tool for the politics of the far right. And then we have a third objective, and that's the international arena of minority protection throughout the 20th century. And here we see two relevant actors. On the one hand, we see transnational NGOs that have been rather supportive, and international norm-setting organizations who have been more skeptical. For example, the Congress of European Nationalities during the interwar period, it was a pan-European lobby group in a way of minority representatives. They advocated non-territorial autonomy, while, for instance, the League of Nations was very hesitant towards this idea. And after the Second World War, collective minority rights were allegedly discredited, and international lawmaking put its emphasis on individual human rights. Although we contest this allegedly so strong rupture with collective rights approaches, we find them in different legal bills as well. And then, of course, after 1989, national minority issues were fully fledgedly reappearing in worldwide discussions. And of course, even though none of the key legal documents in present-day European minority protection, they mention non-territorial autonomy, we find non-territorial arrangements or indications to non-territorial arrangements in the field of culture, education, and identity. But this is already beyond the scope of our project, and certainly this is where many of you here might link to. So to sum up, what we want to do is we want to write a transnational history of non-territorial autonomy as the important third but understudied approach to European minority protection. And this will also sharpen our understanding of the individual and the territorial approaches that are very often interconnected. We analyze non-territorial autonomy as a political idea and as an applied policy, and we argue that this concept has been debated and even applied in larger parts of Europe than many people have thought so far. And we argued that the idea of non-territorial autonomy was flexible enough to translate into diverse, even antagonistic ideological conditions. And finally, and although our project has no normative intention, it of course resonates with the current discussions on how to deal with national diversity and minority rights, and which hopefully also makes it interesting for you, for the political scientists in our Entan group. Thank you very much for your attention.